Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to episode 54 of the Community Development Podcast, and a little bit of a departure from the usual routine. Rather than a recorded conversation between me and a guest, we have a recording of a webinar that was held on Monday the 2nd of March that actually kicked off the 2026 Modern Cockney Festival, a hybrid month-long festival that explores and celebrates all sorts of different aspects of Cockney identity in East London, and is the brainchild of Andy Green, colleague of mine on our social enterprise Grow Social Capital, and a friend of his, Saif Osmani, founder of the Bengali East End Heritage Society, which began in 2016 with an aim to highlight and retain and restore the Bengali community's cultural and heritage assets within the East End of London. The festival was really privileged to have as the guest speaker for the very first event of this year's festival, Prof Joan C Williams, a professor of law at the University of California. She's current director of the Equality Action Center at the Law Department there in San Francisco. She's a founder director of the Center for Work-Life Law, a bit of almost a rock star academic really in terms of her status. She's published many books, most recently Outclassed, How the Left Lost the Working Class and How to Win Them Back. In 2024 that came out, and that book takes on another few steps, if you like, a book she published in 2017 on the Harvard Business Review Press, White Working Class, Overcoming Class Cluelessness in America. The relevance of Joan's discussion to this podcast is that many of us as community development practitioners will be working in communities where there is a large constituency of working class people who are experiencing precariousness, who are experiencing different forms of oppression, which will have different vulnerabilities in relation to the economy and how society is constructed. And so one of the things that Joan does in conversation with Andy, whose voice will be the next one that you hear, is they explore some of the issues around how our political leaderships, political parties, both in the US and in the UK, can re-engage and re-appeal to working class communities, many of whom, frustratingly, sadly, are finding that party politics, the electoral democratic system, is something that doesn't really address the issues that are pressing in their lives. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the festival this year and its programme, it's www.moderncockneyfestival.co.uk. If you'd like to find a little bit more about Professor Williams, you can visit her website, joancwilliams.com.
Okay, so welcome everyone to our session today, the very first of our Modern Cockney Festival on Outclassed. We'll just let a few minute or two for a few people to get in the room. While we're waiting, please put in the chat where you're calling from and what you like about Cockneys. And I'm sure there'll be many things you can put there. So please join the session. Do keep your mic on mute. We will be having a Q&A. Do use the chat for any comments, observations, or any questions you'd like us to take. Let's have some mutual respect in the room. We are recording the session, and certainly the organisers, will be around for after the session for anyone for an informal chat. So please do put in the chat where you're calling from. And what you like about Cockney. Really, to sort of address the session here, Professor Joan Williams from the University of California, author of Outclassed and White Working Class. Before we sort of get into the subject, really, why are we here? Why have we done a Modern Cockney Festival? And really, we're here to celebrate a narrative of Cockney as an evolving community, diverse backgrounds and beliefs, and we believe it's a powerful resource for overcoming adversity, tackling social prejudice, and building greater togetherness for anyone. What we use the definition of Cockneys provided by the broadcaster and comedian Arthur Smith as non-posh Londoners. So welcome here today. And why are we here? What's the sort of challenge we face? Give an example. We found for our work that working class communities don't have cultural institutions to define, defend or advance their interest. As a result, their story gets mistold, negatively stereotyped, ignored, or even in the case of Cockney, airbrushed out of existence. So here's a cover of the Mayor of London's cultural strategy report called Culture for All Londoners. And then it's 135 pages, 35,000 words. Guess how many times the word Cockney was used? For anyone who put zero, you're absolutely right. So challenge here of getting respect, recognition, and encouraging and nurturing working class communities. So we've created what's called an emergent space, the festival, a month-long program of events to encourage discussion, exploration, and discovery of our identity. So really, let's get the show on. So please do put in the chat a warm welcome to our guest speaker. Joan, I've got to ask, where are you calling from?
I'm in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, welcome here today. And as I say, so really just to get show, what's the big question that your work addresses in terms of your book Outclassed and White Working Class? Just to set the context and scene, what's the big theme of your work?
Well, I've been writing about race, class, and gender for 40 years. And I started out working on gender, but I always kept class in focus as well, because of course, gender is classed and class is gendered. But then I left an election night party in 2016 when it became apparent that Donald Trump was going to win for the first time, and went home and wrote an essay called What So Many People Don't Understand About the Working Class that ended up going viral with almost 4 million views and becoming the most read article in Harvard Business Review's 90-year history. Because the motivation both behind the earlier book, White Working Class, which is the book that grew out of that essay, and the more recent book just published, Outclassed, How the Left Lost the Working Class and How to Win Them Back, is the rise of far-right populism and our inability to stop the rise of far-right populism, which has really had such dramatically negative effects, both in your country and in mine, and really throughout Europe. And the book has been translated into the new book, Outclassed, has been translated into Hungarian and Korean. It's really a worldwide phenomenon, this rise of the far right. And what I argue is that it reflects class dynamics that are very similar in the US and in Europe, and I'm sure we'll talk about them.
So before we move on to about yourself, your background, how did your background come to influence your career, your writing, and your study there?
Well, I'm a silver spoon girl. You can see an etching of a cathedral right behind me, enacting my silver spoonness. But my father, who was a New England WASP, which is what passes for aristocracy in the US, married a German Jew, which is what passes for aristocracy among American Jews, in 1946. So this was shocking to both communities of my parents. And I married a working class guy almost 50 years ago. So my entire life, both in my original family and in my marital family, has been bridging class divides. I was really, people ask me, how did you get interested in social inequality? Because I think I'm kind of unusual. Most gender people are just gender people. Most class people are just class people. I've always done race, class, and gender. And what I realized after a certain point is that I'm not actually interested in gender. I'm interested in social inequality and how inequality and different vectors of inequality play off against each other in ways that make inequality very, very resilient. People ask, how did you get interested in inequality? I grew up partly in Venezuela, and I trace my interest in inequality back to when I was actually 9 years old in Peru, looking at this huge, huge altar filled with gold, and asking my father, gee, why are there all those terraces in the hills? Why aren't people farming the valley? And so my early experience growing up in Latin America, I also remember when I first drove into Caracas, Venezuela, where I lived for a few years, when I was 8 years old, and I saw shanty towns up on the hills. And I came from a very upper crust, Princeton, New Jersey, so I was really shocked. So I have been interested in social inequality basically since I was 8 years old.
So in tackling this issue of social inequality, you paint a picture of the rise of populism, and seemingly the typical centre-left perspective is of like fixing the voters who are drifting right. So what's wrong with that response?
It's condescending and self-defeating. That's the typical instinct of higher status groups. The instinct is to attribute lower status groups' disadvantage to their own character flaws. We're most familiar with this in the United States in the context of ugly stereotypes of African Americans, that African Americans are more subordinated because they're stereotypes that they're, lazy, that kind of thing. That is the natural instinct of elites, to attribute lack of advantage to a character flaw. And this instinct of elites to say that the far-right populism stems from the character flaws of the people who vote for the likes of Nigel Farage or Donald Trump is just another example of elites attributing the differences between them and non-elites to the character flaws of the people who are less privileged. It's very unseemly. In the United States, anyway, we tend not to do it in the context of race, but there is a real blindness to class in the United States. And ironically, although in Britain you folks have a lot less trouble conceptualizing class, somehow people haven't understood that far-right populism and the success of far-right populism is all about social class. What the research shows is that the people who have veered to the far right, it's a very specific group of voters in country after country. It's middle status people in routine jobs who are kind of holding on for dear life, but feel very precarious economically. Those are the core working class voters of the far right. And partly this becomes it very much a class issue. It also becomes an issue of geography. For example, in the US, it's often voters in what we call the Rust Belt, the formerly industrial Midwest. That's one of the key strengths of the far right. And of course, in Britain, it's the formerly industrialized North. And that's because neoliberalism was a sort of political and economic system that not only radically increased inequality between people, it radically increased inequality between regions. And you have these left behind regions, both in your country and mine. And people are very angry. I'll just give one other fact, which I think is so important. In the United States, wages used to rise when productivity rose in the decades after World War II. If that had continued, wages would be 43% higher than they are today. So people often ask, why are these people so angry? They're angry because they got screwed. That's why they're angry.
Now, you mentioned there about elites in a ways maybe like stigmatizing the lower orders, but have we witnessed in recent years a phenomenon of divergence of the left from the traditional working class communities? This idea of what's called the Brahmin left, is that sort of a significant factor as well?
The Brahmin left is a term coined by a French, I think he's an economist called Thomas Piketty, very famous. And that's part of a literature that shows that in the decades after World War II, this was true in, again, Britain and America, the left was focused on, in the UK, in the Labour Party, and it really centered blue-collar economics and creating a stable life for blue-collar families. And then after 1970, both in your country and in mine, it was really my generation of hippies that did this. We came up and we were more interested in feminism, which is where I started out, racism, and environment, what are often called the post-material issues. I just call them culture and climate. And the shift from blue-collar economic issues to these culture and climate issues meant that the working class was kind of orphaned. And political science shows that there was what they call a representation gap. There was a very specific group of voters, again, these middle status voters. Their political preferences are economically very progressive, but socially quite conservative. And there was no center-left party or center-right party. There was no party that had that combination. And so this group of voters was kind of orphaned for a few decades until the rise of the far right. And what the far right did is it combined progressive economics, promises, not delivering, by the way, but at least it was talking about getting people jobs, and with more conservative cultural positions. So the Brahmin left term represents what's called the post-material shift, that shift from a focus on blue-collar economics to a shift on climate and culture. And it's not that, for example, that blue-collar people don't care, are climate deniers. You notice again the scorn. They disagree with me because they're stupid. It's that for elites in the United States, climate change is their second or third highest political priority. But for the average American, it's 17th. And that's best summarized by actually a yellow vests sign. Remember the yellow vests movement in France? One of these working class movements. One of the signs said, Macron cares about the end of the world, but we're more focused on the end of the month. That's why you have the priority difference on climate change between elites and non-elites, which again, the Brahmin left interprets as climate deniers. These people are just ignorant. Again, that scorn.
In Britain, we had a celebrity footballer and a sports pundit, a guy called Gary Neville, who described, actions of far right as angry white middle-aged men. And I just wonder, in that class, you described sort of some really distinct culture gaps in terms of attitudes, lifestyles, and so on. Do you want to elaborate a bit more about the difference between culture and life of a working group, class group communities and those of the elites?
The easiest way I think to describe it is that there's a number of major cultural differences between the top 20% and the middle 50%. We've been talking about the middle 50%. The top 20% is very cosmopolitan. And that's a way that and by cosmopolitan, I mean we have a taste for cultures, food, religions not our own. There's a joke which I love. What do you call, Andy, what do you call a Jew in California?
I don't know. What do you call a Jew in California?
A Buddhist. Because, embracing the religion of your youth is so down market, it doesn't display your high human cultural capital. But embracing Buddhism, that just shows you're a thinking person, you're sophisticated. By the way, I mean, Buddhism, like all religions, it has wonderful parts and it has pretty terrible parts, like Christianity, like Judaism. Buddhist activists were at the center of the genocide. But if it's a religion that's not your own, you look at it through rosy-colored lens. If you look at it that it's a religion you grew up in, then that's just a sort of down market taste. I've actually developed something that you folks might find fun. It's called the new class bubble quiz. Andy, we should have arranged to give people the new class bubble quiz.
Send a copy through.
It's just 10 questions, and it will tell you which of these two classes you're in, whether you're in the middle 50 or whether you're in the top 20. And there's one question that is very predictive of whether you graduated from university, whether your parents graduated from university, and whether you're liberal. And that is which kind of restaurant do you prefer? A family restaurant that gives large portions of traditional favorites, or a truly authentic ethnic restaurant. And if you're in the top 20%, you have a strong preference for the ethnic restaurant, cosmopolitan tastes. It's a way of displaying your high cultural capital. But workers, they tend not to be cosmopolitan. They tend to be very rooted for very, very good and sufficient reasons that stem from the logic of their lives. Number one, this group typically gets their jobs through dense local clique networks. They typically get their elder care and child care and help fixing the roof for the motorcycle through these dense local networks. That's also how this group gets its social honor because I mean my crowd, we get our social honor through our jobs. I can show up in London or Korea or Copenhagen or Seoul, and I'm still a distinguished professor. My social honor is portable. But if you sell tires or are a greeter in a store, your social honor, you want to hang around people who you've known forever, who know that you're not just the tire guy. And the other big difference, and your example here of Gary Neville really highlights this, is that non-elites tend to be more patriotic than elites are. Because their imagined community, my imagined community, as I've just said, I grew up partly in Venezuela. My imagined community is global. But for people who didn't grow up partly in Venezuela, their imagined community is quite local, or at most it's national. And so there's a pride in patriotism for a very human reason. Every group tends to stress the high status groups they belong to. That's why I have this in back of me. I'm an old New England WASP. I own etchings. And that's why my crowd stresses we're members of a global elite. We stress class because that's our high vector. But if you don't have that, one of the only high status categories, for example, remember the full Monty? One of the only high status categories those former factory workers belonged to was that they were English. So they stress that category. And again, this very human taste is then belittled by the Brahmin left as being evidence of racism and ethno-nationalism. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it is. But sometimes it's just this very human instinct of stressing your high status category.
You mentioned there about differences in terms of preferences. I mean, what about also differences in, say, aspirations for their children? Are there differences there at all?
Yeah, college grads tend to be extremely shocked at the thought that not everyone wants their kids to graduate from university. This strikes them as a shocking lack of ambition and probably character. But in fact, not only do these top 20% do, and I call them we because I'm definitely one of them. We have a taste for cosmopolitanism as opposed to rootedness. We also have a taste for what we like to think of as sophistication as opposed to traditionalism. The people in the middle tend to be very focused on a hard work ethic and self-discipline because that's what works in their lives. That's the kind of work ethic you need to get you up every day on time, without an attitude, to an often unsung job as an order taker. And so the focus is on self-discipline and they highly value the institutions, the traditional institutions that anchor self-discipline, religion, the military, what they see as traditional family values. Elites are more conservative from a gender standpoint with respect to gender roles than non-elites are. It's really for a simple reason. I may not be a rich man, but I'm a real man. These are social ideals they can attain. And so non-elites, this especially people in the middle, this is not so true actually of people in poverty, but people in the middle tend to be very loyal to traditional institutions. But my crowd prides herself on sophistication. I'm not, I'm a Buddhist, displaying our high cultural capital. And so my crowd our relationship to traditional institutions tends to be one of distance or even disdain. And this is the second major clash. So what the far right does is it takes this clash between rootedness and cosmopolitanism, including patriotism, and sculpts that into fights over immigration. And it takes this traditionalism versus sophistication tension and sculpts that into culture wars. And that explains about 90% of what far-right populism does. It's driven by class dynamics.
Before I elaborate on that, if I invite the audience to put in the chat any questions they'd like us to explore in the Q&A. So building on upon that then, Joan, so What are the mistakes then made when sort of the progressive left, the public bodies, the mainstream, in addressing issues like immigration and talking to the non-Brahmin left, talking to working class communities? What are the sort of mistakes they make?
For one, they call them stupid. People in the United States that we've talked about climate deniers, which is a really good thumbnail example. I mean, have you ever heard people saying that the people who voted for Brexit were just ignorant people who've trashed the economy? I suspect that that happens. Certainly in the US, it's so ironic. One of the ways that this politics of scorn is playing out in the US now is through defense of democracy, of like that my crowd is like, all we can talk about is defense of democracy. I've just done a poll in conjunction with the Center for Working Class Politics here in the US. And we found once again, defense of democracy is the resisting authoritarian is this top 20%. It's their number two priority. For the middle 50%, 10 out of their 12 top priorities are economic. And resisting authoritarianism isn't anywhere in there. And so I often hear, I mean, I would say I'm a typical San Francisco liberal. People all the time are saying these ignorant people are just being led by this con man into trashing our democracy. And I embrace one part of that sentence, con man. But you notice again how systematic that con man, the last presidential campaign in the United States by Kamala Harris, she focused on defense of democracy and abortion rights, very high priorities for the Brahmin left, very low priorities for this middle 50%. These folks did not vote against their own self-interest. They voted against the guy, he was lying, different issue, who said he was going to address their central concerns about economics and immigration. That's why they voted for him. And if the left, either in your country and mine, or mine, wants to win these voters back, it's going to have to learn about what we call the class culture gap, how the culture of the middle 50% is very different than the culture of the top 20%. They have to not only stop calling the middle 50% deplorables in public, which I think the Democratic Party has finally learned, not sure, but the Brahmin left has to stop thinking of the middle 50% as deplorable in private. And that is a cultural moment that unfortunately we have yet to see.
The chat, Nigel, about are the Brahmin left actually old school liberals patronising using the working class, or is it something bigger than that? I mean, is it linked to like the massive explosion in or increase in college education, and something we witnessed in the UK in the last 30, 40 years?
Um, it's I want to just let me jump first to the first comment. Same way people in South Wales coal fields are still called stupid for voting for Brexit. Exactly, sir. That is exactly what I'm talking about. I was actually on a phone call with two people who I won't identify any further. This was in 2017. And the chit chat in the beginning, they were both talking about renovations in their houses and how they were so pleased with their Polish contractors. And then they proceeded to talk about how stupid the people were who voted for Brexit. And I'm going like, listen to yourself. Um, since I study lots of forms of social inequality, Americans, I've studied race for the past 10 years, and you wouldn't believe the racial patterns that play out in professional jobs. It's just astonishing, the raw openness with which these patterns play out. Gender too, by the way. But Americans now know that if they're saying something patronizing or insulting about people of color, they should probably run it through their head one more time and just make sure it's not pure racism. But they don't do that when it comes to class. And so that's where the patronizing comes. Back in my father's generation of liberals in the 40s and 50s and 60s, people were still close enough to that post-World War II dynamic, where if they were saying something insulting about blue-collar people, they would probably run it through their head one more time. And I always think in the US, remember, you folks don't know, but during the Depression, we had this massive public jobs program. And one of the things that they did is they employed artists who painted murals in our post offices. And many of these artists were communists. And they painted these very, very flattering, romantic murals about blue-collar men. That was the relationship of the intelligentsia to the middle 50% in the 40s. That relationship has really changed. The early generation, either because they were communists or else because they were just influenced by workers' rights, ran their condescension through their head so they could stop doing it before it came out of their mouth. That's unfortunately gone now.
Has there been any particular new dynamics at work that have propelled that? Like, getting out of bed, from their traditional bedfellows of the left and the working class.
I mean, there's a whole nother riff, which I don't know if people are super interested in. What really happened is the way that this culture and climate crowd grew up and this was just literally me, this is me search. I was in my 20s and I thought I was so much smarter and so much more virtuous than my parents, who were old school liberals, by the way, because I could see that environment was the cutting edge issue of our universe, and that a social inequality, especially race and gender, not class, by the way, but race and gender were the key issues of inequality in the universe. So this arose because of a generational conflict among elites that continues to go on. This is what's brought us in the United States to very useful slogans called like defund the police and abolish ICE, which just serve to pit working class values against elite values in a way that alienate non-elites. Can I jump into some of the other questions? They're great questions. Yeah. When will the U.S. population realize that the U.S. economy is failing at the same rate as its democratic principles? All I can say, sir, is from your lips to God's ears. There's literally research on this. People ask me, why was it that wages were rising when productivity did in the decades after World War II, and why did that stop? And there's a really simple one-word answer: unions. Wages were rising. Workers got their fair share of productivity when 1/3 of the workers in the United States were members of unions. And then there was this massive and very effective attack in the United States on unions. And who knew? Workers stopped getting their share of productivity increases. The other literature that's really important is that increased inequality predicts low trust in political institutions, including political institutions. And I keep trying to explain to people in the United States that the reason people in the middle are not interested in defending democracy is that they think democracy has failed them. Over 90% of Americans used to earn more than their parents. But if you were born in 1980, you only have a 50-50 chance. They think democracy has failed to deliver the American dream for a very simple reason. It is failing to deliver the American dream. That's why they are not interested in prioritizing defense of democracy. Another question is about the bottom 30%. These are the poor. When the Brahmin left thinks of social inequality, typically they think of the poor and only the poor. And this is something actually that was set up in the 19th century in England. I studied the poor. The poor are quite different culturally than people in the middle and people on the top. I can talk more about that, but it gets pretty academic. The reason I focus on the middle 50% is that that's the reason the far right is winning. It's because the middle 50%. That's why that's the specific class conflict that I'm very focused on. Can I just go down, Andy, or do you want to pitch them?
No, so I got some questions emerging there from about the Frankfurt School from Greg. Is that any observations on that question?
It's great to be in the UK, even virtually. I can't tell you how many book events I've done, folks. Nobody ever talked to me about Frankfurt School and Adorno and Horkheimer. Thank you. Thank you, each one of you. Um, I mean, it's a complicated and ultimately academic answer. Um, I have a lot of problems with the notion of false consciousness. As you can see, my view is that the reason that the working class disagrees with liberal intellectuals is that liberal intellectuals don't understand the logic of their lives and are very condescending. And that to the extent that those cultural differences are described by the Brahmin elite as false consciousness, count me out. Count me out. Um, although at some level, what I just have been talking about is just pure Gramsci. I mean, I come out of critical theory. So, appalling pay has persisted for publicly funded carers and and those similar jobs make a real contribution. Well, this goes back to my the first 25 years of my career, which had to do with actually the devaluation of care work and the way that mothers really get mistreated in workplaces. The devaluation of care work is just part of the devaluation of femininity. We basically have these kind of weird gender packages where, you tell me which of these are important things that adults do. They create new products, they create new ideas, they raise children, and they make sure that elderly people don't die alone. Those are all really important things that adults do, right? The first two are associated with men and highly compensated. The second two are associated with women and radically underpaid. And what we need to do is to say there are two kinds of work that adults do: market work and care work. They're equally vital for a thriving society, and we need to stop overpaying the first and underpaying the second. The last question, is it true democracy when it is bought and paid for by corporations and oligarchs? Um, I have two answers to that. The most compelling is no, it's not. I mean, we just have Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, having laid off 1/3 of the newsroom of one of the two major papers in the United States. But on the other hand, I am a student of history. Democracy, folks, has always been really flawed. Was it Churchill said democracy is the single worst system in the world, except for all the others? So I think it's really important to recognize that our democracies are extremely flawed. Democracies, oligarchs have always had a lot of power. They always have. Now, in the United States, we have this magical tax system where people who get their money by earning it subsidize people who get their money by inheritance or by investment. And that has further increased the wealth and the power of oligarchs. And then we also have we have, government right now by a pay to play narcissistic authoritarian. Of course, that further increases oligarchs' power. So we really need to get in place a suitable tax system. We do not have a budget deficit in the United States. We have a tax problem. And that is partly producing this oligarchic class, and it's subverting the ability of the American government to deliver for the American people. Every human institution is very flawed because there's a very unfortunate fact, which is it's made up of people who are very, very flawed.
Now, talking of flawed, I mean, you got a question there from Nigel about the internet, and are there ways where we can bypass the media gatekeepers, bypass the power elites? I mean, any thoughts on that, Joan, at all?
Well, that was the romantic hope that the internet would spread power and we would have finally power to the people, and we would be able to get away from these terrible gatekeepers you had to get through in order to get your message out. It has not worked out that way. I'm glad there's still one romantic about the internet. Since I live in the center of Silicon Valley, there's not too many romantics about the internet out here. The way the internet, as you know, has developed is two ways. Number one, oligarchs are controlling our access to information and selling us as the product. And number two, has made it so extremists find it much easier to find each other. And those are two separate dynamics that are really, really poisoning politics across the world. And, the European Union has done a lot better job than the United States with regulating the internet, although not very good, just better. But until we get a hold of those two dynamics, where our politics are really going to be in pretty bad shape.
Interesting question from Glyn there about the difference in the UK and US, where working class people call themselves middle class there. This sort of idea of, you mentioned reference blue collar and so on. Is there such a thing as middle class anymore, or is it, are we all working class?
Well, you notice I don't really use those terms because they're very confusing, at least in the United States. In the United States, blue collar people call themselves middle class, and they call people like me rich. When the Brahmin left uses the term working class, typically they're talking about the bottom third, the poor, as opposed to themselves, the professionals. So you notice how in that worldview, the middle 50% are totally left out. There's no words for talking about the middle 50% in the United States. That's why I just talk about them as the middle 50%. Because if I talk about them as the working class people, then people assume I'm talking about the poor. If I talk about them as the middle class people, then Americans, as you know, we're into self-delusion about class. So people who are in the top 5 or 3% in the United States literally think they're middle class. God bless them. They think they're middle class. These terms I tend to avoid because they're very, very confusing.
And as you say, the middle classes have been hit by precarity, and no doubt with the advent of AI and other developments, more so there. Just moving on quickly to a question we've got. There seems to be a lot of hope in the US that come the midterm elections, the democratic system can rectify itself, Congress can assert itself. Are you an optimist or pessimist that will happen?
I'm not a political commentator, but most people think that the Democrats are going to win big in the midterms, which of course are where senators and congressmen get elected. On the other hand, by win big, we really mean squeak through. And what I am really interested in is getting out of what's been called the game of inches, where elections in the United States are razor thin margins, razor thin margins. I think Trump, who won big this time, don't quote me, but I think it was by 1.4%. In an economy that is not working for 2/3 of the people, there is no excuse for the left to be losing or winning by 1.4%. This is absolutely outrageous. And what I'm trying to talk about is how to build an effective set of cross-class interracial coalitions to get out of the game of inches. And there's a very specific group Democrats should be focused on. There are about 40% of Trump voters, and this is a 2017 study, about 40% of Trump voters are economically progressive. Now, half of that 40%, about 20% of Trump voters, are what's called American preservationists. Being white and Christian is very central to their identity, and they have very cold feelings towards people of color. That is not the left's crowd. We are not going to gain those people. We don't want those people. But the other half, so that's 19% of the people who voted for Trump, are economically progressive. They're receptive to messages about climate change, and moderate on a lot of other issues. And their feelings towards people of color are about the same as those of non-Trump voters. It is political malpractice that we are not getting a fourth or half of those voters. So I'm less interested in, can we squeak by in another election in the game of inches where we don't have the presidency and can't accomplish any progressive goals because we don't have the presidency, than getting half or a quarter of this second group of economically progressive voters for the far right that are called the anti-elites. I'm noticing that somebody is concerned about the Brahmin left term. I appreciate Anka for calling me out for that. Now you have articulated something that I've always been a little concerned about, but I've never been able to articulate, which just shows that racism operates very deeply in white people, even white people who spent like 10 years thinking about race. I think there are other downsides to the term Brahmin left, but I had not thought about that racial dynamic, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. And that just shows you how profoundly social inequality structures our intuitions and our common sense.
Thank you.
So, thanks for that.
So really just a sort of promotion for the festival. And we've got over 20 events, including opera, poetry, theatre, family fun days, exhibitions, as well as other online lectures on history, sociolinguistics, tracing your family roots. We've also got National Pie Mash Week next week, where we're seeing the launch of the Cockney Marmite, Do You Like Jelly Deals or Not? As well as the launch of a major report called Pie Mash Futures, and ending with the celebrated birthday of Sir Michael Caine, one of the world's best-known Cockneys. As I say, a whole host of events there. As you can see there, what we're doing is enabling a working class community and culture to explore, discover and articulate its meaning and way forward there. So that's just last sort of mini commercial break. But so before we go our separate ways, Joan, I mean, what's the one thing a bit of advice you would give our mainly non-American audience here about how we move forward in terms of establishing a better future, for our children, grandchildren, and the world at large? Big question.
Just make sure Nigel Farage and the like are not the only ones who are channeling the economic resentments of this middle 50% that used to have a solid, stable middle-class life and now are faced with constant precarity. Because if the left doesn't channel those economic resentments, folks, we know who will.
If we had a medal, a Modern Cockney Festival medal, we'd give it to you for the bravery you've shown there and the endurance of managing the cough there. So really appreciate you coming in. Can you share in the chat a round of applause, please? Show your appreciation for extremely illuminating and profound thoughts there. As I say, I must recommend the books, White Working Class and Outclassed there. Fabulous reads, very powerful, very changing and inspiring. And Joan, hope we can see more of you over here in the future.
Many thanks, and thanks for the invitation. And I always love to talk to UK audiences. You wouldn't believe, talking to US people about class, they just look at you like a Martian. So thank you for being you.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.